In the last week, there have been a lot of political happenings with a lot of discussions around birthright citizenship and dual nationality. So that's something that we wanted to take the time to talk about today. As Americans, and some of us as Franco-Americans living in France, my name is Jessica Singer. I am a U.S. trained lawyer, also barred in France. I work at Capitale Stato with Daniel and with my colleague Elizabeth, also a U.S. trained lawyer.
Tell us about the idea of striking birthright citizenship.
That would go, again, really long history of birthright citizenship in the U.S. dating back to the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, and then for the first time really squarely and firmly addressed by the Supreme Court in Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in the U.S. to Chinese-born parents. He was detained after a trip back from China once, and the state was essentially saying that he was a U.S. citizen, so he couldn't enter. And that was challenged, and the court held that virtually anyone born on U.S. soil will be a U.S. citizen, with certain carve-outs for kids of diplomats, for example. And that's been a precedent that's pretty much held with some minor deviations over the years. That was in the late 1800s. So to go back on that now would be quite important and substantial.
Yeah, I think worth noting one of the arguments in the case the government presented to the Supreme Court in Wong Kim Ark was that he couldn't be a U.S. citizen because he was essentially a subject of the Chinese emperor at the time by virtue of his parents' allegiance to a foreign power. So that was sort of a shaky argument and recognized by the court as being problematic. At the time, the court was more concerned that lots of immigrants who were descended from English and Scottish and French nationals would have their U.S. citizenship revoked. So they ultimately decided in Wong Kim Ark's favor, not because of the merits of his particular case, but because they couldn't understand how it would be equitable to take citizenship away from Chinese Americans without doing that to the entire Anglo and European American population. So that sort of was a deciding factor. It's interesting because that same question is coming up in a Supreme Court case right now, which is going to examine the constitutionality of Trump's recent executive order, which would undermine birthright citizenship as a default right. They're saying again that there's a question of allegiance, that kids born to parents who are either not permanent residents of the United States or not citizens could have their allegiance to the U.S. questioned because of their heritage.
The question of what does it mean to be American was called into question because of the Chinese-ness of him. And for me, that resonates with a person that's undocumented today being of Mexican heritage is saying, okay, well, they're not American enough for me. But even then, at that point in time, they were still willing to say, this person of Chinese heritage is an American. And so what's being examined here is the language of that 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is important because that's what gave former slaves the right to be U.S. citizens because they were born on U.S. territory. And it's this older than time British, English common law principle, jus solus, that you belong to the domain where you're born and you can never isolate yourself from that domain and you will always belong to the land where you're born on. And so that kind of principle had always kind of been in place. And that they recognize that even this person with a Chinese origin to say, okay, but he's still an American because we're a common law tradition and this is our tradition, that the 14th Amendment had the language subject to the jurisdiction of America. Well, those who aren't subject to that jurisdiction as diplomats because they can kind of park wherever and kind of commit crimes. And that, babies being born on foreign invading army warships, like, okay, they're not subject to our jurisdiction. But then basically everyone else, if the police can pull you over, you're subject to the jurisdiction of America. And so that's why it's always been like a fringe idea that this could be revoked, that for Trump to come in and now actually get it revoked. What are our estimations of the probabilities? Maybe less than 50%, but it is a possibility. Now it's a non-zero chance that it could actually have an impact.
I think we have to take it seriously. It's possible.
One of the, I think, most obvious concerns is it could leave a lot of children stateless because they don't necessarily have another nationality to their name, and that's not automatic in a lot of legal traditions.
Yeah.
So depending on where their parents are from, they might not actually have access to another nationality. So we could be making stateless millions of Americans.
Let's talk about dual nationality.
Yeah, let's talk about dual nationality. I'm a dual national. My son is a dual national. You're a dual national.
I'm not yet a dual national.
Oh, you should be dual national. You're French in my car.
But my daughter is a dual national.
And the idea for me of why I'm a dual national, I have two belongings. I belong to America. My folks are there. If ever they got sick, I would need to maybe spend more than 90 days at a time. I don't want to have to get a visa for America. I'm an American. I belong. I'm French. I belong here. I'm more impacted by what happens in France. I vote here. My son's being raised here. My Americanness doesn't undercut my Frenchness my love for my mother doesn't undercut the love that I have for my wife. For me, that's how I see things.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Could get weird quick. Don't think about it too much. But that's why we've seen this trend line in history of nationality laws away from those, exclusivity clauses where it's like, okay, well, maybe France goes to war with Germany, so we'll, only allow French nationality or German nationality. Germany just opened that up last year. And France has opened that up, and America used to be closed off when nationality China was two or multiple. That's a trend line. As more and more people date and meet other people from other countries, you start to create complex families with multiple appartenances, multiple belongings. And that's what I actually think is even beautiful about dual nationality or multiple nationalities, that there might be more than one country they belong to. And unless there's conscription or military service.
What do we think is the likelihood that some sort of act stripping people of dual citizenship would actually be passed?
This has already been litigated. So this went through the Supreme Court in the Afro-Yem case in the 1960s, I think 1967. It was a split decision, 5-4, in favor of saying, listen, just getting a second nationality doesn't necessarily mean that you have intentionally abandoned it, and that your relationship to America, being born here, is so fundamental that you have to have an intentional act of revoking it by going in front of the consulate and renouncing citizenship. And that is the way in which you no longer become American. And this would effectively say, if you got a dual nationality, like how we're seeing Japan and Korea and China and Iran and India and so forth, you lose your other nationality. Versus a lot of the Western tradition is now a pluralistic approach. You can have Canadian or Australian or UK or French citizenship.
That's really a due process argument, right? You can't just involuntarily strip someone of something without any sort of individualized procedure.
Yeah.
Also discriminatory, possibly.
I think that's one of the more alarming elements of this wider discussion is it's coming in the context of a poor economy, which is exactly what happened when there were efforts to revoke the 14th Amendment after Reconstruction. People are upset that they didn't have enough money in their pockets and they thought foreigners were getting jobs that they deserved.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the same kind of rhetoric right now. We're seeing specific communities targeted by the president in a political fashion. And I think that what they're doing is setting the stage for a sort of tolerance for this stripping of rights that is quite dangerous and is going to nip at the rights of Americans who are firmly cemented in their own nationality. Our rights are next. So I think it's something that whether you have a direct concern about this or not, I think it's something that we should all be worrying about.
Do we think it's political theater, or do we think it's actually likely to happen?
As with a lot of Trump's shenanigans, I think it's political theater with a specific target. And I think there's a plan behind it. So I wouldn't laugh it off.
And we can't dismiss it.
And I think between these two subjects, we're talking about birthright citizenship, which is so fundamentally anchored into the U.S. legal tradition, and dual nationality, which I would say is still pretty anchored, 60 years, but less anchored. I would give slightly greater chance that this could be an issue or come up as a topic. Let's go to law school for a quick second. Stare decisis is this Latin term for let the thing stand. It's been decided once, let's let it keep. And that makes for good legal processes, because if you've got stare decisis, that means that not because Obama and then Trump and then, oh, do I have these rights? Do I lose these rights? It doesn't just flip with the political coin. Let the thing stand. Notably, Clarence Thomas, your favorite Supreme Court justice, said that he doesn't believe in stare decisis, which it's an approach to be had. And I'm not here to poo-poo it, because I think he's smarter than me as a person. But that the idea that you should just decide things, what is the best thing to decide. Don't let prior case law determine what should be the outcome, especially at the Supreme Court level. So on the one hand, there's legal tradition, and then there's the other hand is upending legal tradition for what may or may not be the better policy that's pursued. That's why I'm keeping the ear for this bill. As soon as the bill becomes a law, it would be struck as unconstitutional at the district court and then at the circuit court. But then eventually the Supreme Court could hear it. If we chose to hear it, then we might have this reopening of this conversation with an impact on your daughter and on my son and on myself.
There's some serious constitutional questions that would be posed by this. Also logistical questions and what they're trying to put forth. I don't even know how we don't have a database that keeps track of dual nationals.
No, we don't. Or the fact that Trump has 4 children of which would qualify in theory for dual nationality. His wife would qualify for it. His wife's 2 parents dual national. You might end up having some weird alliances where it's like, no, I want to hold on to my nationality. All the people of Jewish origin who were able to obtain Spanish or Portuguese or Polish passports. All the Americans with Irish or Italian ancestors that want to be able to have this dual passport system.
There's also a significant number of congressmen and senators who are direct beneficiaries of the birthright citizenship that we hold dear in the country.
And there are a lot of people with big investments around the world who hold dual citizenship for those purposes as well. There are a lot of mixed interests here. I guess like maybe one final question or thought is, if you had to renounce one of your citizenships, what would you do?
I probably wouldn't talk about it on camera.
I don't think I've got an answer for that question. I was born American, quite American from 0 through 18. At a certain point, I lived here long enough that I felt like my nationality has shifted to becoming American living in France as my nationality. Now that I got naturalized in 2023, my nationality for me has shifted to Franco-American. I'm also of Mexican origin and of Irish origin. And the question was, if you had to lose one, which one would you lose? Like
Yeah.
taking out
It's a part
parts
of
of
you.
yourself. Yeah, I've become French. It's become a part of my identity. So the idea of me giving up one, I would be very hard pressed to choose, but I might have to say I've become more French than I'm American, and that I live here, and this has now become my home. So if you put me back to a wall, maybe I would say French, but I don't want to have to choose.
You and I are both looking at applying for naturalization in France soon. Does that raise any questions for you about the timing of that?
I'm gonna go forward and see
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah, me too. It's precarious, aren't you, doing it though?
We are a French immigration law firm, so we're just kind of talking off the cuff as U.S. immigration attorneys, although Elizabeth did practice U.S. immigration law before joining us. But our focus is France. I think what's interesting is the idea of France as a haven. So I feel like I can have a home for myself here in France. I felt less and less that on the U.S. side I have to just be very French. I have to be very sincere with the listener. That France does grant visas. They're usually almost always a way to come here to France. So that's not necessarily the conclusion of this conversation, but for a person who doesn't necessarily feel themselves being identified politically by the current U.S. political regime, there's a place for you here in France.